Hi, my name is Emily Frey, and I'm the Citizen Science Program Coordinator at the League to Save Lake Tahoe.
And I'm Meghan Collins, Education Program Manager at the Desert Research Institute.
We are going to talk to you a little bit about microplastics today. So first off, let's start with a basic introduction of microplastics. Meghan, can you tell us what microplastics are?
Sure, I'd love to. The general consensus is that microplastics are smaller than the width of a pencil eraser, so that's about 5 millimeters in length. But they can also be really, really tiny, even smaller than the width of a human hair. And some scientists classify these actually as nanoplastics. And different sized plastics can cause different sized issues in the environment, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. The next question that really comes to mind after, defining them is, where are they coming from? And there are a number of different sources. Microplastics that come from the breakdown of larger plastics can end up in our wastewater. So everything that goes down the drain, some of them can contain tiny pieces of plastic, for example, from synthetic clothes that break down. Cars that drive along the road on synthetic tires can cause wear and tear of those tires in tiny little pieces, and that can cause microplastic pollution. If a cigarette filter is tossed and that breaks down, theoretically, all of those little pieces could end up in the environment. And finally, large plastic litter, in theory, also could break down as a result of, say, wave action or wind action or sand or UV rubbing up against those. There are also somewhat mysterious sources of microplastics that float in the air. You all have seen those if you are sitting at dusk near a window and the light is streaming in and you see pieces of dust that are floating. Some of those pieces of dust may have been particles from your clothing that shed off, or from your carpets, or even upholstery. Not all of the dust in the air is plastic, so don't worry about that, but there is a portion of it in both indoor and outdoor environments that does contain microplastics. So what's really interesting is, if you looked at some of these microplastics under the microscope, they would come in all different shapes and sizes. Sometimes they're even classified by color. So sometimes the microplastics are little flakes. So if they've rubbed off something bigger, say a kayak scrapes against a rock, it might come in the form of a flake. If you have an acrylic sweater and some of those fibers break off in the washer or in the dryer, those are going to turn into little microfibers. Likewise, if farmers lay down plastic while they're planting in the spring to keep the moisture in the soil, and those plastic films break down, or the waterproof layer from your coat starts to just decompose and break off, those can be little flakes. And we've also heard about beads, in little micro beads that come in some of our cosmetics. Thankfully, because of an act that was enacted in 2015, most of our cosmetics don't have micro beads anymore, but those beads do exist on the market still.
Great. So it sounds like microplastics are found in a lot of different products that we use day to day, and can also shed in many different shapes and sizes and ways into the environment. What kind of threat do microplastics pose to Lake Tahoe's ecosystem, our wildlife, and our population of humans as well?
Sure. So a simple way of breaking it down is, what are the impacts to water quality? What are the impacts to wildlife, and then to humans? For wildlife, there are a number of different laboratory studies that have been looking at, and this is worldwide, not in Lake Tahoe, but laboratory studies that are looking at the impacts of microplastic ingestion by different animals. And obviously, larger pieces of plastic that are swallowed can cause problems with digestion. But even smaller pieces of plastic, when chemicals or microbes latch onto them, can cause potential impacts to wildlife or even drinking water. And that is one of the big questions right now in the area of water quality. With respect to human health, there have been a number of studies looking at the presence of microplastics, basically asking the question, are microplastics present in drinking water or in bottled water? And it really depends on where you are. We have been working hard to get a basic or a baseline preliminary understanding of the presence of microplastics in our region. And so we've studied surface waters of Lake Tahoe as well as stormwater and on snow.
Great. And at the League to Save Lake Tahoe, our mission is to protect and preserve Lake Tahoe's water quality for future generations. So our concern is that microplastics could potentially be a new contaminant in Lake Tahoe. So that's why we're really excited to be partnering with you, Desert Research Institute, to help determine the sources of these microplastics as well as their potential impacts, and then identify ways to prevent them from being introduced into Lake Tahoe further. With that, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you are detecting microplastics, these tiny little microplastic particles. How can you find them in our environment?
Sure, that's a really great question. Most of the work that we have done has dealt with microplastics making their way into water. And so if you want to know what's in the water, you need to first filter it. And I'll explain the different ways that we've done that. But the basic process is filtering the water. And if there's anything like organic material or sediments that are going to block our view of those microplastics, we need to get rid of that somehow. And so that might be separating out by density, separating out those sediments, or using something to dissolve the organic material. And then once we have just the filter and whatever microplastics might be there, we actually put it under a special type of light that illuminates those plastics in a certain way. And then we take a picture and we identify them that way. So that's the main process. How we get that water, how we sample that water is really what makes a difference in the lab or in the field. So for example, when we sampled for stormwater with the pipekeeper volunteers, we outfitted each of our volunteers with 4 aluminum water bottles. And they carried those water bottles to the site, filled them up, carried them back to the league, where we then collected them and brought them back to the lab, where we filtered them. Another approach, which we used for sampling surface water, was actually taking much higher volumes of water. And we actually brought our filters right into the field. We pumped water off the surface of the lake, flushed that water through our filters, and that allowed us to sample much higher volumes of water to get a more robust understanding of really how much is in the lake. If you are studying microplastics on snow, what you need to do is collect the snow and then melt it down and then put it through that filter process.
You mentioned volunteers helped collect the stormwater samples for the microplastic study. And those were actually our pipekeeper volunteers, which was a really exciting partnership between the League to Save Lake Tahoe and Desert Research Institute. The pipekeeper program works to prevent stormwater pollution from entering Lake Tahoe with the help of community scientists in the Lake Tahoe area. Our pipekeeper volunteers monitor pipes all around the basin, and they collect stormwater samples to help identify and manage stormwater pollution. And when I say stormwater, I mean the water, rain or snowmelt, that's running over paved surfaces and picking up pollution on its way to Lake Tahoe. And in the past, the pipekeeper program has focused mostly on the fine sediment pollution that is found in stormwater. But with the emergence of microplastics being potentially found in stormwater, the program may be evolving to look more at additional pollutants that can be found in stormwater. It's a really exciting opportunity for our pipekeeper volunteers to be involved in this study. And I'm very curious if you can share a little bit of the results of what our pipekeepers helped to discover as far as microplastics in Lake Tahoe goes.
Yeah. The first result is that group was a fantastic group to work with. We really lucked out with the level of knowledgeability and the willingness to contribute people's experience and knowledge, so we were really grateful for that. There were 6 locations that we sampled, and at all the locations we did find microplastics in the grab samples. And at most locations, we found more plastic fibers than other types of microplastics. And we also found, in general, greater numbers of teeny tiny pieces of plastic as opposed to larger ones. The most important result to us as scientists was this grab sampling method at, using volunteers at pipes worked. And that means that we can employ it in other places to continuously monitor stormwater outfalls. And we've had some really interesting conversations about the differences between areas where that stormwater is filtered through, say, filtration basins or other best management practices versus not. So there's a lot of really interesting possibilities that could be pursued with those pipe keepers.
Great. Well, our pipe keepers loved working with you, and we're so grateful that you see the value of having citizen scientists help collect data for research opportunities. So next, I'd like to talk a little bit about sources of microplastics in Lake Tahoe. So globally, you mentioned that microplastics can come from wastewater, can come from the production of plastic, the breakdown of plastic, breakdown of car tires, things like that. But Lake Tahoe is considered a pristine area with not a very large human population living in it full time. So we don't have any manufacturing in the Tahoe Basin that's creating plastic products. So Lake Tahoe is very unique, but yet we're still seeing microplastics in our area. Do you have any ideas on what those sources are specifically for our Lake Tahoe region?
That's a great question. I'll start with what the sources definitely aren't. Mm-hmm. So in some waterways, wastewater, once it's treated and it's cleaned, is actually filtered back into a river or a lake. We know that is not a source of microplastics into Lake Tahoe because we do not have wastewater that's filtered back into Lake Tahoe. There's been a lot of really great work, as you alluded to keep those fine sediments out of the lake, and that probably does also contribute to keeping microplastics that run off the road into the lake. So the scale of the microplastic problem in Lake Tahoe is smaller relative to, say, other places that we've sampled, like the Las Vegas Wash. But the sources of microplastics into Lake Tahoe are, similar to other very pristine places around the globe. For example, microplastics have been found in remote locations of the Pyrenees in Europe, presumed to be deposited there on the wind. So tiny plastic particles or fibers blow on the wind and they land on snow. My colleague, Dr. Monica Arienzo, has done sampling of snow pits, so taking snow after digging snow pits in pretty remote locations in the Sierra, from the northern end of Yosemite all the way up to Sagehen, which is about 25 miles north of Truckee. And she found microplastic in snow samples in all of those locations. So the hypothesis is, yes, it's atmospheric deposition is one of the sources. Anywhere people live, there's a chance that things are going to escape. So litter, if people are leaving either large pieces of litter or even tiny pieces of litter, there's a chance of it breaking down. There's not a lot of literature on that, so that's a supposed source. But nonetheless, it's important to just put the litter where you should put it. And then if there's no wastewater, another question is, are dryer vents a source of microfibers from synthetic clothes into the environment? So that's a question that's out there and that we would like to contribute to answering.
Perfect. And right now, are there any personal changes that you can make or someone can make to reduce the amount of microplastics entering the environment?
That's a really great question. So there are obviously things we can't control, like wastewater treatment and the amount of cars on the road. But if you do choose to, take a trip to Pyramid Lake or to Lake Tahoe, carpool, why not? It's not only less, less synthetic rubber breakdown, but it's also a bit less carbon into the environment. There are a number of different things you can do related to washing and drying your clothes. For starters, high efficiency washers not only save water, but it's been found in other scientific studies that higher volume wash loads actually produce more synthetic microfiber emissions. So using those high efficiency cycles and avoiding those delicate cycles, which do use more water, can help. Clean out that dryer lint catcher every time you use it. The more lint that you leave in that dryer catcher, the more is likely to go down the dryer vent exhaust and right into the environment. You can also look up lots of different products for reducing synthetic microfiber emissions through the washer and dryer cycle, like a mesh bag, like a ball that you can throw into your dryer, or even filters that can be affixed to either the wash water or the end of your dryer vent pipe. In addition to that, there are actually cosmetics that, while they don't contain microbeads, may actually have other synthetic sources that help, say, your mascara stick, or their parts of pigments. So those natural cosmetics are better choices if you want to avoid microplastics. And the last solution, which was a surprise to me when I first read it, was that disposing of paint can also be a source of microplastics into the environment. We all know that you shouldn't pour paint down the drain or into a sewer. But also, when you wash out those paintbrushes, maybe that you use to touch up the interior of your house or the exterior, you want to keep that wash water contained and then dispose of it the same way you would dispose of paint that you're no longer going to use, which means fill that container with kitty litter, wait for it to harden, and then toss it in the trash. So lots of little things you can do.
Those are great personal solutions that I may not have thought of. I didn't know about the paint one. I thought that was a really great tip. We're doing a lot of house improvement right now, so really helpful. I want to add as well some maybe more obvious ones, like don't litter. That's a big one that has a really big impact. Make sure that your trash is getting into the proper receptacle, because those pieces of trash can contribute to the breakdown of plastics and more microplastics in our environment. And in addition, just switch to reusables as much as you can to prevent and reduce the amount of plastic that you're using in your everyday life. So things like getting a reusable water bottle, or using your reusable bags at the grocery store, or even bringing your own jars to getting bulk food at the grocery store. Things like that can really cut down on the amount of plastic that you're using in your day-to-day life. And therefore cut down on the amount of microplastics ending up in our environment. You can also help by cleaning up trash at your beaches, on trails, in your area. If you're in the Tahoe Basin, you can also join the League to Save Lake Tahoe at one of our many beach cleanups, or get involved with the Tahoe Blue crew and adopt an area near you to keep clean and monitor for trash and pollution in your area. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we finish up?
No, my pleasure. I can't emphasize enough how great it's been to work with you guys. You're so knowledgeable, as are your volunteers. So keep fighting the good fight.
Thank you so much, Megan, for joining us. Thanks for telling us all about microplastics. And if you'd like to learn more, you can visit the League's website at keeptahoeblue.org. Or Megan, where can we learn more about your work?
DRI.edu/microplastics lab is a great way, or just Google DRI and microplastics, and we've got a lot of great information.
Perfect. Hope to see you guys out there.